In this demo, we're going to take a stock ECMLINK ECU and we're going to set it up for the first time. The car we're using today has EVO 8 injectors, it has an EVO 8 mass airflow sensor, and it has a misadjusted throttle position sensor and a non-working idle switch. So we got a couple things there we can play with. The first thing I'm going to do is configure the ECU for my injectors. You do that using the global fuel adjustment field and the dead time field on the fuel tab. You want to set the global fuel value to something that's appropriate for your injector size and your base fuel pressure. If you're not sure how to calculate that, you can use the calculate button here. I know EVO 8 injectors flow about 545 cc's, and stock pressure on this car is 42.6, so I'm just going to leave that alone. And you see the application has calculated a global fuel adjustment for me. I'll just click use and it copies that field value down here. Dead time field. Dead time on EVO 8 injectors is close enough to stock that I'm just going to leave this set to 0. If you have different injectors, you're going to need to set some value in there. You can get some starting points off of our wiki. There's a base injector settings page that lists common injectors and some starting points for the dead time. You're going to tweak that a little bit just based on your data logs, and we'll cover that in another demo later. But that'll give you some starting points. For now, we can leave this to 0 because EVO 8 injectors are pretty close to stock. The fuel adjustment table that you see here, this is the RPM-based wide open throttle adjustments. These are not used to compensate for your injectors. They are also not used for idle or cruise tuning. They're not going to work the way you want for those two things, so you only use these sliders for doing your wide open throttle tuning. The other thing you want to set is the base map type. Like I said, this car has an EVO 8 mass airflow sensor, so I'm going to select that here. If you've got something different, you need to make sure that this is set correctly for your configuration. And again, we're going to leave this one zeroed out, just like we did the fuel RPM tables, because we're just not dealing with those right now. But this table is the one you're going to use to dial in your airflow, and there are a couple different ways you can do that in ECMLINK, and we'll cover those later. So I'm going to hit Save All to ECU. And then I'm going to start a data log here, and I'll start the engine. So there we go. A couple things you can look at in the log right away is that the front O2 voltage spiked up and running a little rich. That's the front O2 right there. That's completely expected behavior. The car is currently running in open loop mode as it's warming up. And there we go. We see the O2 sensor voltage dropped, and now it's just cycling up and down just like it's supposed to. That's exactly what you'd expect to see in your logs when the ECU is running in closed loop mode. So don't get too worried if you see your sensor cycling up and down. So at this point, everything looks pretty good. I'm going to blip the throttle a few times here. Yep, everything seems to be okay. Except we notice our idle here is it's a little high and it's bouncing around a lot. Because if you look over at the RPM tab, we have our target idle set to 900, and it's bouncing around more like 950, and it's really jumping around a lot. So we need to figure out what that is. The first thing you want to look at is the idle switch indicator. That's what tells the ECU that it needs to be idling the engine. Right now you see that set to 0. With my foot off the throttle, that should not be 0, that should be 1. So we know we've got a problem there. And if we look at throttle position, again, my foot's completely off the throttle right now, so 2.7 is not correct. You would expect to see 0%. We have a built-in adjustment tool called TPS Adjust down here that we'll use to adjust that. But in order to do TPS Adjust, you need to give the application a full throttle swing from your foot completely off the throttle to your foot all the way to the floor. I'm going to go ahead and do that now with the engine running. You do not need the engine running to do it. You can do it with it off. But there we go. So now the application has seen what the throttle position looks like when you're completely off it and when you're completely on it. So it can calculate the adjustment for you automatically if I just select that here. And what it's done is it brought up the RPM TPS tab with the suggested adjustments in place. They look pretty good to me, so I'm going to hit Save to ECU. Now we'll go back to our data log. And you see the throttle position. That's still not quite as low as I'd like to see it. 0.9%. I'm going to go back and I'm going to manually adjust those values now. This is the offset that's applied to the throttle position signal, so I'm going to drop that down by a couple more and see what that does. And yep, there we go. Now throttle position is at 0%, just like it's supposed to. Idle switch is still not working. This car actually doesn't have a working idle switch, so we can configure ECMLINK to simulate that for us. We'll just click that button there and hit Save to ECU. Now if we go back to the data log, you see the idle switch has switched to 1. So now the ECU, and you can see it here in the log as well, that's where that red line just went up. So now the ECU knows it's supposed to be idling the car, and we're going to see values more around the 900 RPM point that we had set. Alright, I think that's it for the basic setup. There'll be more demos in the future showing some of the fuel trim setup and a little more information on some of the other things that we skipped through, but that's what I would do to basically set up an ECU for the first time. Hope that helps.